to be on time. Is English okay for you? Okay, so our English is not so good, so we'll be able to understand each other's. We have modified a little bit the program, but the content will be the same because we have 1 hour. The first hour will be in connection with also Oman, because we have to give a conference to the residents in Oman. So we will start with an overview on opioid toxicity, so that it will be also dedicated to Omani residents. And then we'll do the tract as it was previously scheduled. Unfortunately, Dr. Rebecca MacDonald is unable to come today, so we'll try to do also her presentations. So Badria is trying to connect with Omani center. Sorry? Yes. Okay. Okay, so today there will be mainly 2 speakers. So the first will be Dr. Hossein Hassanian from Tehran. He's responsible for probably the largest emergency medicine department dedicated to poisoning in the world. I think about how many patients per day? Hossein? 70 patients, poisoned patients per day in his emergency department. And of course in Iran you will see that opioid toxicity is a major issue, so they have many opioid poisoned patients. Hossein is also the chair of the scientific committee of the Asian Pacific Society of Clinical Toxicology. So we're very happy that he accepted to participate to this tract. And myself, my name is Bruno Megaban. I am the head of the intensive care unit in Paris, which is dedicated to poisonings. So we have less poisoned patients. We have approximately 600 poisoned patients per year, but of course more severe poisonings. And I am intensivist. So I'm very happy also to be here, and I am a member of the Minatox board, and I was responsible for the organization of the scientific program of this Congress. So we are very happy both to welcome you to this symposium dedicated to opioid toxicity. So now we are in connection with Omani residents, and we will start. So good morning everybody, good morning to Omani residents in Muscat, and we'll start with an overview on opioid toxicity, and we'll talk about the opioid overdose crisis. And you are aware that this crisis is mainly in the US, but you will see that it is also, unfortunately, worldwide. So, as you know, today, opioids represent the first cause of toxic deaths in the US. You see on this slide the approximative number and percentage of deaths related to each psychotropic drugs, and you see that opioid, and mainly opioid analgesics, represent the first cause of mortality in the US. And this issue was recently popularized by the deaths of very important people and singers in the US, like Prince. This is also the case in Europe, but probably with less impressive figures. However, you have to know that in Europe about 1.3 million high-risk opioid users exist, and it has been estimated that about in 85% of fatal poisonings, an opioid play a certain role in toxicity. So opioids are really importantly represented in the most severe and the fatal overdoses, even in Europe. When you look at the emergency department, and this is a study from Euroden work group, and this study reports all the drugs, mainly illicit drugs, that are responsible for the reference of a patient to the emergency department in relation to the use of a recreational drug. And you see that opioids in red are well represented among these 20 most commonly reported drugs to the emergency department in Europe. And of course, heroin is probably the most dangerous and is in the first place. You have also methadone and also buprenorphine and all other opioids. So why there is such a problem with opioid toxicity? The first reason is that opioids are more and more available in the world. And you see here, based on the figures from the US, there is a quite good parallelism between the amount of opioids sold on the market, the number of opioid poisonings, and the number of opioid-related fatalities. And you see that all these lines are going up in a very impressive way during the first 20 years of our recent century. This is also the case in Europe, and you know that since the banning of dextropropoxifen from the market, there was an increase in the number of codeine and tramadol prescriptions. And you see here also there is a quite good parallelism between the increase in the prescriptions of these two opioids and the increase in the number of fatalities attributed to tramadol and codeine. So all over the world there is an increase in the number of deaths related to opioids. Although there is a debate regarding the real consequences of the banning of propoxifen from the market. Of course, this slide shows you the evolution of the number of deaths in the UK following the banning of propoxifen. You see that, of course, here is the banning in 2005, and you see the decrease in the number of deaths attributed to propoxifen, but it doesn't seem in this study that there is a consequence on the overall number of opioid-related fatalities in the UK. So probably it's not a direct effect of the banning of propoxifen from the market. Because in Europe, things are more complicated. I don't know exactly the situation in Turkey, but we'll have a presentation later on this issue. You see that according to each country, the kind of analgesic opioids used is quite different. You see in France, for instance, we have mainly the prescription of tramadol and codeine. But you see here in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, the situation is quite different. So each country, each European country has its own uses and prescribes different opioids for analgesia. So that complicates the epidemiology and the figures of the opioid-related fatalities. But one important issue is that when you prescribe an opioid analgesic and when this opioid analgesic become available at home, then clearly there is an increase of the risk of overdose and of fatality among the individuals living at this home. And you see that this increase will also regards the individuals who do not receive opioid prescriptions because of misuse and because of the possibility of the family members to use these opioids that have been made available at home. So, first reason, opioids availability is increasing. So, second reason, opioids are responsible for addiction. It seems obvious today, but this was not the case 30 years ago. And you see that in the US, the physicians were taught that prescription of opioid analgesics is not responsible for the development of dependence and addiction. And this was based on a simple letter of 5 sentences published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980, and which was uncritically cited as an evidence to support that analgesic opioid therapy is not responsible for addiction development. And you see on this slide the number of citations of this simple letter, which was based on an observational study among 1,000 patients, saying that there is no opioid dependence development. And of course, this information was wrong. And the physicians in the US were taught, based on this study, during years, that they are allowed to prescribe opioid analgesics without any risk. And this was, of course, false. And based on such studies, the physicians started to prescribe analgesic opioids. And you see, the emergency physicians play also a deleterious role. And there were high-intensity prescribers among the emergency physicians who prescribed large amounts of opioids that become available at home in those patients who consulted to the emergency department, probably initially for a good reason, but they prescribe a huge amount of opioids, and these opioids become available at home. And of course, as explained previously, supported the development of misuse and addiction among the members of this family. And of course, the companies, the pharmaceutical companies, profited from this situation with a very intense marketing among the physicians, the prescribers, but also among the patients. And you know that one company called Purdue Pharma, which marketed oxycodone in the US under the name OxyContin, is now accused for the deaths of about 500,000 patients in the US due to opioid abuse. And this is the members of this family, and they became, based on this only compound, probably one of the healthiest family in the world. Of course, due to all these reasons, availability of opioids, increasing number of prescriptions, the number of fatalities attributed to opioids increased during the 21st years of our century. They increased till about 2010. And you see here, there was a plateau in the number of opioid fatalities, just related to the fact that the American health authorities decided at that time in 2010 to ban from the American market just one product, which was the oxycodone that is able to be crushed and injected intravenously. So just at that time in 2010, just the banning of one compound from the market allowed to plateau and to stop the increase in the number of fatalities attributed to opioids. But what was the problem? Immediately, you observed here in red a decrease in the number of fatalities attributed to oxycodone, you see, but concomitantly, an increase in the number of fatalities attributed to heroin. So what was the problem? The health system in the US created opioid-dependent patients. When the health authority decided to ban oxycodone, which was abused by intravenous injection, these patients switched from oxycodone use to heroin use. And in 2010 till 2015, heroin reappears in the US, and the number of fatalities attributed to heroin re-increased once again. So it was not a success. And you see on this slide that the shift between the abuse of oxycodone and opioid analgesics to heroin was like simultaneously. You see that the number of prescription opioid use decreases, and in the same time, the number of heroin increases, like in a parallel way. So this really supports the fact that the development of opioid use in the US was only related to the development of addiction. So first reason, opioids are available, more and more available. Second reason, you created opioid-dependent patients in the country due to a huge number of prescriptions, and even if you modify the kind of molecules that are available, patients are dependent, so they will change from one opioid to another according to availability. The third reason, of course, is that opioids are responsible for neurorespiratory depression in case of overdose or misuse. You know that the control of ventilation is related to centers located in the brain stem, and mainly in the pons and the upper part of the medullary, medulla. And you see here these two centers, the pneumotaxic center and the apnostic center. And these centers command those responsible for the contraction of the inspiratory muscles, and those are mainly located in the dorsal respiratory group center. And you know that inspiration is active, related to the contraction of inspiratory muscles due to these inspiratory neurons, while expiration is only passive, related to the fact that inspiratory neurons stop to stimulate the inspiratory muscles. So inspiration is active, related to contraction of the muscles, and expiratory is passive. And of course, in these centers, you have opioid receptors, and that is the problem, because opioid receptors are expressed in the centers that control ventilation. And you know that stimulation of these receptors, mainly mu receptors, will cause a dose-dependent depression of respiration. So all mu receptor agonists will induce respiratory depression. And this depression is related to a reduction in the brainstem sensitivity to CO2. It is related to a depression of pontine and medullary centers involved in this rhythmic respiration. It increases the apneic threshold, it decreases the hypoxic drive to respiration, and even it has some activity on peripheral centers like carotid body chemoreceptions. This depression is characterized by a dose-related depression of the resting ventilation, with a reduction in the tidal volume, a reduction in the respiratory rate, and of course a consequent decrease of PaO2 and increase in PaCO2 with the onset of respiratory acidosis. Probably the mu2 receptors and some of the delta receptors are responsible of these side effects, while kappa receptors seems not involved or even protective in some models. So the centers of respiration are in the brainstem, and you have opioid receptors in the brainstem. So opioids are able to depress respiration, and that is the reason for the danger. And this is clearly demonstrated that when you use an opioid, even at therapeutic dose, you may develop respiratory depression. And you see on this slide, in relation to the dose of your opioid, and here morphine equivalent dose, you have an increase in the number of apnea during your sleep. So if you are treated with an opioid, you may develop apnea episodes, mainly during your sleep, and you may die, of course, if this apnea is prolonged. And this is related to the dose. And this apnea, these apneic episodes may, in case of an overdose, goes till the onset of an opioid syndrome, which is the usual presentation of an opioid overdose. And you know that opioid overdose presentations includes impairment in consciousness, miosis, and bradypnea. And these three symptoms are characteristics of the opioid toxicity. And SpO2 and respiratory rate are surrogate indicators of ventilatory drive, although they provide rather limited information on the drug effects on ventilatory control, while the minute volume and the PaCO2 are the best markers to measure the ventilation, but unfortunately they are more difficult to access directly at the bedside. When you prescribe an opioid, you have to know that you increase the risk of fatality in your patient. And you see here, if you prescribe an opioid to a patient during 1 year, you will increase his risk of death by 50 times. So the availability of opioids, the increase in availability of opioids will be related to the increase of the risk of death in the population. But the dose is not the only problem. That's an important point also to understand. There is, of course, a quite good relation between the dose and the risk, but the dose is not only the problem. And you see that on this slide. We compare in this slide the concentrations of various opioids, here methadone, and here buprenorphine and its metabolite norbuprenorphine. In the first line, in patients who died directly from an opioid overdose, and in the second line, in patients who were opioid users but died from another reason. And you see that the concentrations are almost the same. So it is not so obvious that death attributed to an opioid overdose is in relation to the dose or to the concentration. So there are risk factors for the development of opioid overdoses. Of course, one important reason is the molecule you use, the opioid. And you see here that the risk of respiratory depression from prescription opioid overdose is not the same, and it depends on the molecule. And you see clearly that fentanyl and methadone are the most dangerous molecules responsible for a highest number of fatality rate, while codeine probably and maybe tramadol are less dangerous. And you see, if you take one for the risk with codeine, you have about 22 for fentanyl and 14 with methadone. So the molecule is important. And of course, some of these molecules may also have additional mechanism of toxicity, and we will discuss this during the symposium. Like, for instance, tramadol is also a serotoninergic molecule. So all these additional activities on different receptors will contribute to the toxicity in relation to opioids and will increase the risk of complications and side effects. And fentanyl is very well known in this area, because fentanyl may be responsible also for chest wall rigidity that contributes to the toxicity. And this complication is relatively well known and was suspected based on several observations from fentanyl-related fatalities. With fentanyl, death occurs in the therapeutic range in apparent non-naive opiate abusers. And that clearly questions the onset of dose-dependent respiratory arrest as a mechanism of the death. But also when you analyze these cases, there is a lack of measurable metabolite, norfentanyl, in almost half of the cases. And so that support the fact that the death occurred very rapidly, probably in relation to this acute chest rigidity before the expression of a neurorespiratory central depression. So you have additional mechanism of toxicity with fentanyl that increases the risk of fatality onset. And of course, with the multiplication of the different molecules, the different compounds, you have new pharmacokinetic patterns, new pharmacodynamic patterns, and you see that the delay of action, the duration of action is very variable among the different compounds, and this is a difficulty to manage opioid-related toxicity and increases the risk, of course, among the patients. One important point also is the mechanism of toxicity in the chronic users. And this is related to the development of tolerance, but also abstinence. So there are two theories to explain why people used to use opioids are at risk of death. The first hypothesis is the tolerance theory. When you use an opioid, you will develop a tolerance. But it is supposed that the tolerance to the analgesic effect will develop more rapidly than the tolerance to the respiratory effects. So that if you have a tolerance to the analgesic effect, you will increase the dose, but the tolerance to the respiratory effect is still not here, and then fatality may occur. This is the tolerance theory. There is also the abstinence theory. And here, for any reason, a chronic user of opioids may stop his opioid use. And this is well known if the patients go to jail, for instance. Then the tolerance will decrease due to this abstinence. And when the patient will reuse or reconsume his opioids, then he will have a risk of death. And this theory have been assessed based on the measurement of opioid concentrations in the hair, and it was demonstrated that before the onset of an overdose, there is a period of decrease in the concentration of opioid in the hair due to this abstinence period. So you have both theory to explain the risk and the vulnerability of these patients. And of course, as you know, opioid is not the only molecule that is used by opioid abusers. And if you analyze the hair of those who died from opioid overdose, you may find almost all kind of psychotropic drugs in the hair. So they abuse many drugs, licit and illicit drugs. So there are interactions between all these molecules, either pharmacokinetic or pharmacodynamic interactions, and these contribute to the onset of fatality. Finally, of course, you have to know also that there is a genetic vulnerability among some patients, and this support an increased risk of toxicity. Probably all of you know this very famous case, and this was a woman who came to the emergency department after the delivery of her child, but unfortunately her child died a few days after delivery. And it was demonstrated that she fed him with her milk, and she was treated with codeine at pharmacological doses. But she was an ultra-rapid cytochrome 2D6 metabolizer, and due to this genetic pattern, she produced morphine from codeine instead of producing norcodeine, which is an inactive metabolite. And this milk rich in morphine was responsible for the death of her child. And since this case, codeine is forbidden during during lactation, during breastfeeding in women. So it's a relatively new contraindication. But this is not only the only case, and you have also genetic related vulnerability with other opioids. And this is the case, probably less known, with tramadol. You see that tramadol is metabolized in two active metabolites. M1 with cytochrome 2D6 pathway, and M2 with cytochrome 3A4 pathway. And this patient who overdosed with tramadol presented a very severe cardiovascular failure, which is not supposed to occur because tramadol has not so severe risk of cardiac toxicity. And it was demonstrated that this patient presented a very severe cardiovascular toxicity due to the fact that he was an ultra 2D6 metabolizer, so he produced M1 metabolite from tramadol, but also in the same time, a few days before his poisoning, his general practitioner prescribed him ketoconazole, which is an inhibitor of cytochrome 3A4. So he blocked this route, and his tramadol goes only in this way by the cytochrome 2D6, and he produced a very elevated amount of M1 metabolite, resulting in the observed toxicity. So gene vulnerability is important. The fourth reason for the crisis is the emergence of the new recreational opioids, and this is really the most important problem today. And to let you understand, I have produced this slide, and please, we will follow each line to understand, and you will see that there is 3 phases for the opioid overdose crisis. So if you remember, the first crisis, the first reason is the prescription of analgesics by the physicians, and mainly by the emergency medicine physicians. So follow this line, prescription analgesics. You see that there was an increase in the number of prescriptions of opioid analgesics and the number of fatalities till about 2010. And then, as explained, just here, there was a plateau in the number of deaths related to analgesic opioids, just related to the banning of crushable oxycodone from the market. But immediately, as you remember, there was an increase in heroin. Follow this line. You see here that heroin is relatively low, and then it increases here when oxycodone was banned. So this explains the second waves of deaths related to opioid overdose in the US. And this is between 2010 and 2015. And then follow the blue line. And you see that this is related to fentanyl derivatives. And it was relatively low, and then about 2015, it goes up like in a vertical way. And this is the fentanyl-related fatalities. And to date, it has been estimated that almost 85% of the opioid-related deaths in the US are in relation to fentanyl derivatives. So now the physicians created the patients, the dependent patients, and now the patients change from analgesic opioids to heroin, and from heroin to fentanyl, because of availability and cost, of course, because heroin, you have to bring it from Afghanistan, and it's expensive, while fentanyl, it's produced in the US territory, and it's like a pharmaceutical presentation, so it's more safe, you know exactly what you have inside, and it's much more available in the market. You can buy it from internet, from the darknet, without prescription. So this is the new recreational drugs. And why fentanyl? Because fentanyl is a complex molecule, but you see that it is easily changeable. You can create new derivatives based on chemical synthesis, and this is relatively easy to do. This is relatively easy to do, and you can produce very powerful molecules. And you know that probably some of these molecules are 10,000 times more powerful than morphine, even than the fentanyl. They are so powerful that some of these molecules, like carfentanil, and we'll have during this day a presentation on carfentanil. Carfentanil is available, but it has no possibility to be used or prescribed to humans because it's so powerful. It is used for elephants in the veterinary medicine, for elephants and rhinoceros and so big animals, but not in humans. But you can buy it on the internet easily. And you see here in Europe, we have the same problem. And you see here the number of seizures related to the new psychoactive substances, and in red here, those who have opioid activities. And you see a relatively evident increase in the amounts of opioid-like NPS during the years. And here, how you can buy them. You see here, this is a bottle with butyryl fentanyl, and it contains the amount to allow about 100 puffs. So you can buy this bottle from internet, and you can go to a party and use it. And you imagine the number of possible deaths among the people who will use this or misuse this in the party. So it's really dangerous. One interesting point also is to know that these fentanyl-related poison patients will present with the usual, the traditional opioid presentation. That means consciousness impairment, meiosis, bradypnea. But you see in these patients, the onset of some aspects, some clinical aspect, may question and may probably suggest to the physician that toxicity is related to a fentanyl. And you see these patients may present tachycardia, may present hypertension, may present renal insufficiency, agitation, which are not common features with the usual opioids. So such features may question the possibility of fentanyl derivatives. Sometimes you may have additional symptoms, like here, acute skin and hair symptoms with this synthetic opioid called MT45. And you see you have the development of a folliculitis and dermatitis in the patients that may suggest the use of these opioid derivatives. But of course, one important issue is the toxicological analysis, because to really know which compound is responsible for the toxicity, you will require an analysis, a solid analysis based on the use of complicated technologies, including liquid chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry. And you see that you have to probably use mass spectrometry in tandem or very sensitive spectrometry. And this is not available in all the countries and in all the hospitals. So that the final diagnosis is sometimes difficult to assess. And that's why in many countries you have no figures, no statistics, because you have no solid and pertinent possibility to make these analyses. So what to do, finally, what to do, last chapter. Of course, it is important that the physicians have to be aware about the risk of opioids with reasonable prescriptions, supervised dosing with long-acting opioids, and of course the health authorities have to limit the access to the market of the most dangerous opioid molecules and to support the spread of opioids with better therapeutic ratios. They have to regulate the market of illicit opioids, and we will discuss this during the symposium to allow a multidisciplinary approach of opioid addiction, and this is important, with maintenance treatments, with different policies like supervised injection sites or needle exchanges. But this is not enough. Hopefully we have an antidote, and this is a very efficient antidote. It is Naloxone, which is a pure opioid antagonist at the mu, kappa, and delta receptors without any agonist properties. And this antidote is available worldwide. It has been widely used to reverse opioid toxicity, is efficient. It is responsible for a dose-dependent reversal of opioid agonist effects. And it is relatively easy to use, although there are some inconveniences. We'll have time to discuss about this, because it may precipitate acute opioid withdrawal syndrome if not well used in the patients. But anyway, it is efficient, so we have a real efficient antidote. And it has demonstrated that in the majority of the cases, almost 80% of opioid fatalities, the death occurs at home 1 or 3 hours after the exposure and in the presence of a bystander. But this bystander do not do anything that is useful for the patient. He just observed the patient. So BCLS by bystanders are usually ineffective, not sufficient. And there was in the US and now in many European countries the development of a policy of preventing opioid overdose deaths with take-home naloxone. What is take-home naloxone? Is the prescription of naloxone to all patients who are opioid users so that they can put this naloxone at home, and in case of any problem, the bystanders, the family members, will be able to use the naloxone mainly by intranasal or intramuscular administration to prevent the risk of fatality onset. And you see here that this policy allows in the US the prevention of about 25,000 fatal overdoses in the last years. So it is really effective, and it's now developed in the European country. I don't know if it's available in Turkey, but you will tell us. So in conclusion of all these overview. Opioid-related toxicity represents a challenging health concern worldwide. There are several reasons. The first reason is the increase in prescriptions with the increase in availability. And of course, this was based on inadequate prescriptions in the majority of the situations. The second reason is the development of dependence. If you use an opioid, then you will develop dependence, tolerance, and there are risks related to tolerance and, of course, abstinence if you stop using opioid during a certain period of time. The third reason is the individual vulnerability, and this vulnerability is related to gene, but also to non-gene explanations and reasons. And the fourth problem, of course, is the emergence of opioid new psychoactive substances on the market. So all these reasons explain why we are facing now a crisis of opioid overdoses in the US, but also in the whole world, and in Europe for sure. I don't know in Turkey the situation. So preventing opioid overdose deaths appears as mandatory. It could be achieved with some policies like maintenance treatments, take-home naloxones, but of course for the future, new strategies based on preclinical findings have to be developed, but of course with more uncertain timelines for such developments. So thank you very much. We were in connection with Omani resident staff, and now my presentation is open to questions from you, from the audience, and maybe from the residents from Oman. Thank you very much. So please, any experience or any question? Yes, please. Maybe with the micro, because...
Dr. Hassan from Oman. In the hospital that I practice in, we have a lot of sickle cell disease patients who are, most of them are dependent on opioids. What we use there, or what have been used since the last more than 15 years, they used pethidine to control their pains. So then they became dependent to pethidine. Like per day, they are coming, each one of them is coming around 3 times per day because he is dependent on pethidine. And each visit, he will take around 200 to 300 mg of pethidine. So I don't know if there's any alternative to that, how to solve this issue, and like if we can shift them to something else, and how easy it will be. Because they continued on that, because it was started by hematology since more than 15 years back.
That's a good question, if I understood everything. That's a good question. I think we'll discuss this later on, because we'll have different presentations on how to allow the treatment of dependence with different policies, with maintenance treatments, and you will have different approaches, because you will have the Iranian approach, which is quite different from the French approach, and you have different possibilities. But it's a complicated problem, and there is not one solution for that problem, of course. But as you understood, really, if you prescribe once an opioid, then you expose your patient to the development of a dependence. And then the problem is difficult, and you expose him to the risk of respiratory depression if he misuse his opioid or if he overdose. Another question?
there?
We are waiting for Omani. No.
We have no questions.
No question. Okay. Okay. So we will stop. Okay. We have stopped the communication with Oman, and now we'll back to our symposium. We have changed a little bit the organization, and now we'll start again. I suggest to continue with the opioid receptors, which is the first presentation that was expected.
Did you give them the lecture?
I will give them.
Okay.
It was okay.
You are going to give them your lecture?
Yes.
Then maybe we can give them the slide.
Used in a theatre situation, you know roughly how much is going to knock somebody out, make them unconscious if you like. But what you're trying to avoid is giving people too much of the agent that will kill them. And the difference between how much will knock a person out and what will kill them is called the safety factor. And there isn't any agent that we know of that has a large enough safety factor to ensure that you can release it and just knock people out without running the risk of killing them.
And that goes to the cardinal principle of poisoning and toxicology, that the dose makes the poison. And when I teach my residents and students, we talk about a variety of different drugs and chemicals. If you look at ethanol itself, a typical one drink has 12,000 milligrams or 12 grams of ethanol, and that's just one drink. So to become intoxicated or impaired by ethanol, it's tens of thousands of milligrams. And yet other drugs, like digoxin, for instance, is used therapeutically at less than a milligram, of 0.25 milligrams, a very, very small amount. So when you think about opioids, for instance, if we use morphine, we use typically 4 milligrams of morphine. But when we use fentanyl, we use maybe 100 or 50 micrograms of fentanyl. Again, it's an order of magnitude smaller. And carfentanil, then again, is a whole nother order of magnitude more potent. So it really kind of depends on the drug. And even if you think the tiniest amount may not be lethal, you go up by a small factor and it's apt to be quite lethal. So the Moscow theater crisis took place in 2002, as I mentioned, and what had happened was that there was this theatrical performance. There were about 800 folks that were attending this performance, and then this group of Chechen terrorists basically took over the theater, and they had their political demands, and they weren't going to let anyone go until the Russians met their political demands, and they threatened to blow up the building. And this gripped the nation, not only of Russia but also around the world. This was on the front pages, and they let a few of the children go, but they kept most of the hostages. And then on the third day, they threatened to start killing the hostages if their demands were not met. And so what the Russian security forces did is they began an assault of the theater, and there was a gun battle, and then they finally got control of the building. Unfortunately, Many people died in this takeover. Now, this is a picture of one of the dead hostages, one of the dead terrorists who died. But there are also many of the theater goers died as well, or if they didn't die, they were certainly unconscious. And this is a bus of people who had been taken out of the theater. As you can see, they're unconscious, and the question was, what happened? And the Russians don't necessarily like to publicize a lot of the stuff that they do, and it was hard to get information about exactly what had happened, and it brought up many different issues. So what was revealed at the time was that there was apparently some sort of gas that was put into the theater, and the intent was if they filled the theater with the gas, that everyone would become unconscious, including the terrorists, and that the Russian military forces would then be able to restore order and put down this action. But in fact, not only were almost everyone unconscious, but there again were all these fatalities, and it was kind of a novel approach to this counter-terrorism insurgency using some sort of gas, and the question was, what was the gas? And then there was a lot of speculation, because you think about a state-sponsored event, the Russian military, and the first thing you might think of is, well, is it some sort of chemical warfare agent? And when you think about chemical warfare agents, you often think about nerve agents. And so, was it a nerve agent? Now, there was a lot of attention to this because around this time and in the years leading up to this, there was the Chemical Warfare's Convention, which had outlawed the use of many of these chemicals. And so the question in the minds of a lot of folks was, did the Russians somehow go against the ban of these chemical warfare agents? And so people were thinking about, is it a nerve agent? And yet nerve agents generally don't just lead to unconsciousness. Often they can lead to seizures and status epilepticus and sledge-like symptoms as well. But that was not what was manifested here. So thinking about chemicals or drugs that may put people out, you think about, well, maybe benzodiazepines. Now, benzodiazepines generally by the oral route are relatively safe. If you take a massive overdose, you can certainly have a very significant CNS sedation, but typically to put someone out and decrease their respirations or kill them is usually through an intravenous route. There was no intravenous administration here. It was inhalational, and benzodiazepines we generally don't use inhalationally. So was it something else like BZ? Now BZ, even though it's often the same abbreviation for benzodiazepine, is a incapacitating agent, which is considered a chemical warfare agent, and mechanistically it operates like a anticholinergic agent, and again, the symptoms were not really consistent with BZ. BZ, has only been used by militaries. Not a lot of public reports about the use of BZ, but there's the long name of BC, and of interest, militaries across the world have looked at a number of incapacitating agents to be used on the warfare that may not kill, but may disable the adversary. And in this case, it would work through probably the confusion that one might generate through the use of an anticholinergic, because anticholinergics do cause a delirium. But that was not, again, the manifestation in these patients. And so when you think about patients that become unconscious, comatose, and then have respiratory depressions and may die from respiratory arrest, you think at the top of one's list about opioids. Although opioids as an inhalational agent, there really was very little experience about that. Although it sounded like the toxidrome that was associated with all these people from the theater sounded like an opioid toxidrome. So the Russians at that time said that they had used some sort of anesthetic gas, and that it was something potentially with fentanyl. So that was the information that they publicly released, although a gas, fentanyl is not usually a gas. It's used as a parenteral agent. So again, there are a lot of missing points. Now, there was a German toxicologist who had the chance of examining a couple of these patients in the ensuing days, and he thought that there was some sort of anesthetic gas. He wasn't exactly sure what it might have been. Maybe a halogenated anesthetic. Certainly, it sounded like some sort of inhaled gas that would put people down, but he was unable to do any sort of laboratory determination specifically. So I particularly got interested in this case because I had just come back from Russia about a month before this event, and I was over in Russia, actually at this demilitarization conference. It was actually quite interesting. And I've been to Russia twice. The first time I'd been to Russia, I spent some time in Yekaterinburg, which is a city in the Urals, and it was a fascinating place. I spent this time at this toxicology hospital, saw a lot of interesting poisonings there, and it happened to be the same city that the Tsar was killed back at the time of the revolution. But when I went to this conference in 2002, I got to speak to a Soviet scientist, an ex-Soviet scientist, and I asked him, what sort of novel drugs had they investigated during Soviet times, and he said a very interesting drug, which I had never thought would have been used by the military. He said they were trying to weaponize dioxin. Now, dioxin is a chemical that is not a fast-acting chemical, but it's a chemical that in certain animal species, particularly guinea pigs, is extraordinarily toxic. Although in humans, its toxicity is not quite like it is in guinea pigs. It may potentially be a carcinogen. That remains somewhat unclear, but it's known to cause chloracne, which is this very disfiguring dermatologic process. And what was so interesting was, now this, fast forward about 2 years, but the prime minister candidate in the Ukrainian elections in 2004 was Yushchenko, and during the midst of this election, he broke out with this very disfiguring eruption on his face, and before anyone pinpointed what it was, it certainly was suggestive of chloracne. And I thought to myself, wow, the Russians or the Soviets had potentially militarized dioxin, and here we have a prime minister candidate who is very anti-Russian breaking out with this chloracne. And as it turns out, he was poisoned with dioxin, and he had the second highest dioxin level that had been recorded up to that date. So the Russians were very interested in a variety of different poisons, and this goes back years before that with Georgian Markov, who was a Bulgarian journalist dissident who, on a London bridge, was stabbed with an umbrella that had introduced a tiny bit of ricin, which is a very, very potent mitochondrial inhibitor, and he died. At the time, they thought he died of septic shock, but subsequent investigation revealed that he died from ricin. Very novel, intriguing, and the Russians have a whole legacy of using poisons, even as recently as in the last year or so. But this was Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006, who died from polonium 2010. So by putting all this together, I'm thinking, there's the use of ricin, there's the polonium, there's the dioxin, and now we have this strange gas, which is not quite clear what exactly happened. So if you go back a few years before the Moscow event, there were a series of reports that were in the public domain. Subsequently, they've been removed from the public domain, but they're public domain about chemicals that were used for incapacitation and so-called less than lethal technologies. And this was of interest because in adversarial situation, you may not want to, kill the opponent, just disable them in some way. So there were active research programs from militaries around the world looking at some of these non-lethal weapons. So here it says that non-lethal weapons are weapon systems that are explicitly designed and primarily employed so to incapacitate personnel or materials while minimizing fatalities, permanent injury, etc. Non-lethal weapons will not be required to have zero probability of producing fatalities. So again, the thought is that the chemical can incapacitate. They may not be 100% perfect in terms of not causing a fatality, but the intent is not to cause a fatality. And there are a number of different approaches, some chemicals, but of interest, and this is kind of off the subject, but certainly of interesting, is some acoustic technologies. And you might have read over the last few years about various folks that have had these disabling neurological conditions thought to be some from noise. This happened at the Cuban embassy in Cuba and elsewhere. I think there have been some European events as well, using noise that may incapacitate, not chemicals, but again, this kind of less than lethal technology. So in 2000, which was right before the Moscow event, there was this report that came out about the advantages and limitations of combatives for use as a non-lethal technique. And what's on the front page but fentanyl? So I thought, wow, this is really fascinating that, that fentanyl itself, which was known as this very, very potent opioid, was being investigated as a non-lethal technique, because we think, oh my God, fentanyl is so potent that it can easily kill. This report discussed this sort of drug class. It's not really a pharmacological class per se, but the so-called calmative, which is to depress the central nervous system and produce, a coma perhaps. And the ideal calmative should be easy to administer, short onset of duration of action, should be reversible, hopefully, and there was a lot of research into this. And not only did they discuss calmatives per se, but they also discussed inhaled calmatives in terms of aerosolized opioids. Now, looking back then, no one had really, at least in the medical community, had been thinking about aerosolized opioids. It wasn't any sort of a pharmacopoeia approach to the treatment of pain, although in general anesthesia, one uses inhaled agents. They're not opioids. They're the hydrocarbon-based agents, but that's what's conventionally used in general anesthesia. So going back to this report with fentanyl on the front cover is actually a paragraph about carfentanil. And before this time, I'd never heard of carfentanil before, but it says carfentanil has gained new interest because of the recent pursuit of novel calmative agents capable of unconventional administration. Although not yet used in the human population, this drug offers the potential advantage of being administered to non-compliant or violent patients in situations requiring only indirect contacts. So you think, why did the Russians utilize such a strategy to try to put down this terrorist uprising? There was literature to support the fact that a opioid, a fentanyl derivative like carfentanil may be, an agent that would serve that purpose. I still couldn't get. Still wasn't clear to me about the aerosolization of this. I did an extensive literature search at the time, and there certainly wasn't anything in the medical literature. But there was this one report from this company, this drug monitoring company called Cross, and they were conducting a number of studies. And one of the studies they were conducting was on aerosolized carfentanil. I said, "Oh my God, we have a company that's monitoring a study using aerosolized carfentanil." All these people just went down in the theater. The Russians, although they wouldn't say exactly what they used, probably used aerosolized carfentanil. Now it's all kind of coming together. And so carfentanil was produced by Janssen Pharmaceuticals, the same fellow that developed fentanyl, and it's a fentanyl derivative. Its mechanism of action is similar to fentanyl. It works, through the opioid receptors, but it just happens to be much more potent, as you'll see. And at this time, it was actually available as a pharmaceutical, but not for people, but for big animals. And it was marketed under the trade name of Wild Nil, which was used to immobilize large mammal species, usually to move them from place to place, not to kill them. And in the package insert, it talks about how it had been demonstrated in deer and moose and elk and other sorts of large animals. And I have this one video here. Could you just tap? There's one more video here.
Matthew Matinda is standing by with a tranquilizer.
Acil, 10:45.
It'll be a few minutes before Wendy goes to sleep.
So this is a good situation. She's not too panicked. She hasn't given alarm calls, so the rest of the family are relatively secure. She can't quite figure out what's happened to her. She's been stung by something that really hurt, but she's okay.
So this carfentanil is not meant for people. It's meant for big animals like big elephants, and you get the right dose. It's used not to kill the elephant, but to sedate the elephant so they can move the elephant from place to place. And that was the intent of Wild Nil. So wild African elephants, an animal that carfentanil is used on, weigh between 5,000 to 14,000 pounds, which is roughly 26 to 72 times the weight of your average adult male. And we'll get into why carfentanil over the next few slides. So this was a table I put together. Soon after the Moscow theater event, I got interested in the whole thing. I wasn't savvy to any data that was not in the public domain, but by piecing together what I've described, we wrote this paper, and I put together this table looking at the potency of carfentanil versus fentanyl versus morphine. And versus morphine, it's 10,000 times more potent, which is just extraordinary. Even versus fentanyl, it's 30 times more potent. So it's a very, very potent analog of fentanyl, as are a number of the other fentanyl analogs as well. Now, fast forward to 2012, this is the first paper, the first and I think only paper, that analyzed clothing and urine from the Moscow theater casualties and revealed both carfentanil and rhyming fentanyl. So this is the only literature in the public domain that confirms the exposure, but what the Russians had used back then to try to sedate the folks in the theater, but not kill them, although they ended up killing many of them, was carfentanil. So if carfentanil is used to sedate elephants, why is it showing up in heroin? And that was the question that's come up in the last several years. Now, if you go onto some of these drug sites, so there's a number of drug sites where drug-using people share their experiences. And there was this dialogue, this was back in 2011, about carfentanil. And one of the guys says, the last one says, "Oh guys, I just found this on another forum. A guy says he went down to Mexico, bought carfentanil from a pharmacy down there. This is the only report I've stumbled upon for Wild Nil, which is the trade name that I mentioned, and I haven't found any for Immobiline. This stuff, it seems like that the stuff is safe for use as long as you take extremely small amounts of it at a time." So it was even discussed among the drug-using community as this really powerful opioid, although warnings that you have to take a very, very small amount. And if you go onto the internet, you can find recipes to synthesize the carfentanil. And then the first reports starting in late 2016 about heroin being laced with this carfentanil at the same time that you could actually buy the carfentanil back then over the internet. So why carfentanil? It's about 100 times more potent, or 30 to 100 times more potent than fentanyl, but only slightly more expensive. So from a drug dealer standpoint, you can cut it into much larger volumes, creating stronger, cheaper highs, and the drug dealer makes a lot more money. So that's why carfentanil is out there, and the fentanyl analogs, there's a lot more money to be made by the drug dealers. And comments from users. One user was so distressed when he received a package labeled carfentanil, a free sample from his supplier, that he asked for advice on Reddit about how to dispose of it safely. Another user stated, the only use I could think of it would be to kill people. A third user said, dealers are just starting to learn how to volumetrically dose their fentanyl poison bags, but killing us in the process. We are their guinea pigs. So this is further data from that CDC article just showing that so much of the fentanyl, at least in this report, was now contaminated with the carfentanil. And it's only gotten worse, and it's not just carfentanil, but it's also a number of other fentanyl derivatives. Which leaves me to the last slide in terms of how do you treat these patients. And they're suffering from the effects of opioid poisoning, you want to try to reverse the effect. Now, we use naloxone routinely in the setting of any opioid overdose. Different people have different thresholds for use of naloxone. If you go by the textbook and those who are most experienced with it, we tend to want to reserve the use of naloxone for those who are having respiratory depression, because this is where it can really make a very dramatic difference and reverse the potent effects of the opioid on the respiratory depressive centers. Routinely, it's often used for patients that are CNS depressed, and you can wake them up, but you're running some risks if you do it routinely on everyone who's depressed. For one reason is you can precipitate withdrawal, which can lead to all sorts of other complications. Moreover, the half-life of naloxone is relatively short, and so if someone goes into withdrawal, they may not ever want to be engaged with you in the hospital, and they may want to just leave the hospital. But then the naloxone can wear off, and they can become re-sedated with the opioid, depending on which parent opioid that they use. So a number of problems with using naloxone on every altered mental status patient. In another situation, if they've taken a combination of sedating drugs, you may reverse the opioid and not reverse the other drug. For instance, as I've had personal experience treating patients who've taken both opioids and benzodiazepines, and they're sedated, and you think, okay, well, it looks like an opioid, their pupils are myotic, let's use some naloxone. Use the naloxone, and they don't wake up, but you put them into withdrawal, and one of the manifestations of opioid withdrawal is nausea and vomiting, but they're still sedated because of the benzodiazepine, and now they're vomiting and have a significant aspiration risk because they're vomiting in a sedated state. So naloxone is not to be used injudiciously. It's best used in patients that are manifesting evidence of respiratory depression. In terms of the dosing of the naloxone, it's not clear how much you need with some of these fentanyl analogs. What we've heard is that for some of these cases, they may not be responding to the usual small doses, and they may require larger doses. Now, naloxone typically is usually provided in ampules of either 0.4 milligrams or 2 milligrams. In the opioid-dependent patient who's suffering from respiratory depression, a very small dose is apt to reverse the respiratory depression, even less than 0.4 milligrams, like 0.04 milligrams. A very small amount may reverse the respiratory depression. It may not totally wake them up, but it may reverse the respiratory depression. It works at the small dose best with morphine or heroin, which is metabolized to morphine. With some of the synthetic opioids, there tends to be a need for a larger dose, like with methadone or sometimes with fentanyl or with some of the fentanyl derivatives. And so if they're presenting like an opioid toxidrome, they're depressed, and you don't think, although it's hard to know for sure, but you don't think that they've had a mixed ingestion, you would start off with a small dose of naloxone, like maybe 0.4 milligrams or even smaller, 0.1 milligram, and then you'd go up on the dose if they're not responding. If they don't respond, ultimately it may be because it's some other exposure, it's not even an opioid, or it's a mixed ingestion where the opioid is not reversing the concomitant ingestion. typically the maximum dose of naloxone is upwards of about 10 milligrams or so, and sometimes you do get a better response with a larger dose. The biggest downside, again, is the downside of withdrawal. But unlike benzodiazepine withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal, which can lead to seizures and other potential life-threatening manifestations, opioid withdrawal is usually a more benign presentation, with the caveat that if they're having significant GI distress when they're concomitantly CNS depressed, that may lead to aspiration. So one last concern about carfentanil and some of the fentanyl analogs is the risk of secondary exposure for the healthcare provider. They come in touch with the powder, not just the healthcare provider, the safety officer, the police in an occupational setting. Is it possible, because this drug is so potent, that just touching it or being in the same room with it is apt to cause some sort of depression? And ACMT, the organization that I work with, and others have come out with recommendations regarding precautions for emergency responders in the setting of fentanyl and some of their analogs. And on the ACMT website, which is acmt.net, under toxicology resources and position and guideline statements, we actually have a statement on preventing occupational fentanyl and fentanyl analog exposures to emergency responders. And here's the statement. You can look at it at your leisure. It doesn't downplay it as not being a risk, but for the most part, it's the chance of absorbing enough of it dermally is so low that one doesn't necessarily have to take special precautions beyond the usual precautions one would take with handling something that's potentially hazardous. And there's some detailed recommendations on the position statement. So with that, I think I'll end the little talk and open it up to any sorts of suggestions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any question?
So what I can understand from what you're saying is that for the fentanyl analogs, dermal exposure, so standard precautionary measures are enough, right?
I'm sorry, say that?
Is it just the standard precautions
Yes.
are enough for the dermal exposure for fentanyl?
Yeah, the standard precautions, I mean, universal precautions and whatnot, but the concern by some folks in the occupational sector is you have to start wearing special gear, getting onto the whole get-up that you would with a potential sarin gas exposure or something like that. And one does not need to do that. There are still those who do get geared up, but we feel that's an overreaction.
May I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Let's back to Moscow theater attack. We are facing... I said let's back to Moscow attack. We are facing a lot of people that are coming out of the theater with respiratory depression, probably myotic pupil, and loss of consciousness. And we have not enough time to intubate all of the patients together. That's why the mortality was so high. So in my experience, any comatose patients should get naloxone. And I'm not sure why their medical team didn't prescribe that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. So in the case of Moscow, though, the authorities didn't tell anyone what they were using. So yes, clinically it seemed like an opioid overdose, and they should have responded that way. But it had never happened before. I mean, this was the first time in history that such an event had occurred. And you saw some of the folks in the bus, and they were just comatose and no airway, and many of them died because they weren't getting the attention that they needed. Hopefully, we learn lessons from history. So if there is ever a next time, we would be better prepared. There were all those ambulances. I think there was one picture, or I may have left it out. There were a whole bunch of ambulances right outside the theater, but no one was prepared with the naloxone because no one had said that they're going to have an opioid effect, and so many people died needlessly, unfortunately. Has anyone in your countries seen any of these fentanyl analogs at all?
Most of the time, we don't know what they're using actually.
Yeah.
We just know the patient and symptoms, and we're managing the patients based on their symptoms.
Yeah.
Because most of the time, the patient doesn't know what he or she is using actually.
Yeah, yeah, and that's true in the U.S. as well. And one of the limitations of the analytical laboratory is that it often doesn't really provide this sort of information, as I think most of you recognize. Not to say that it's going to necessarily change the management of the patient either, for that matter, because you have to manage them based on your clinical intuition and acumen. But from a public health standpoint, from an epidemiological standpoint, it would be much more useful if we had that degree of granularity in terms of what they were using. We're currently, have applied for a research grant to study this further, but beyond the research setting, in just the clinical setting, we often have no idea what we're using. And the other thing, particularly with fentanyl, for instance, depending on the laboratories, is most standard, at least in the U.S. hospital laboratories, don't have fancy technology. Even in some of the best hospitals, what they use is simple immunoassays, which for opioids look for the analyte morphine as the analyte, and things that are metabolized to morphine. So codeine and heroin are metabolized to morphine, and so if someone's been using heroin or been using codeine or morphine, it's going to trip it positive. But particularly with the synthetics, like the fentanyls, it's not going to cross-react at all. And so if they were using pure fentanyl or carfentanil or one of these analogs, you'd get a negative test for opioids. And so that can be very misleading, particularly to the less experienced physician who says, oh, the drug test is negative, and you tell me he has an opioid overdose. It doesn't make any sense. But one needs to understand the laboratory and its limitations. Yep.
This was a good point, actually. So to sum up, it means that if we face someone with the symptoms of opioid overdose, and we couldn't find anything in lab exams, including morphine, codeine, or the other routine opioids, we should be suspicious for fentanyl or the other alternatives. Do you have any sort of these patients in Turkey? What's the most opioid that they are using and they are overdosed? Morphine.
The socioeconomic level is so they don't have any money to buy this type of drugs.
And maybe it is not available, actually.
Sorry?
And maybe it is not available.
Could be. We don't know. I mean, we don't see a lot of patients with opioid intoxication, to be honest. And also we have some certain limitations to test these patients because of our laboratories, so we can understand with our test results too. So that's why we are actually judging these patients with clinics. That's it. And most of the time it works.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Bruno, do you have something to add? Is it good we go in this way?
Because if you are not able to assess sometimes so we require very good quality to be able to recognize all this is difficult.
In our hospital, we cannot work on paracetamol. Yes.
Most of the time, actually, lab exams don't change your management. That's the main point. You should manage the patients based on their presentation, not based on the lab exams. The lab exams is useful for research or probably for further public health concern. Yeah, but for us as a clinician, it's not very useful. Not, you want to add something?
Yeah, except for the one case of paracetamol. So there, it's very helpful, and if you don't have that, you know, it's very challenging. I mean, I have to say that, you know, with just, I mean, it's a side subject, but, you know, with paracetamol, obviously with the acute single ingestion, the level is very important. But all those other cases, either the chronic cases or the delayed presentations, then the level, you know, doesn't help you. There may not be a level at all. In that case, you have to use your clinical acumen again and look at other factors such as the liver test. But with a single acute acetaminophen, without getting a level, you know, it's, you know.
In your experience when using Naloxone to reverse anti-related toxicity, do you use higher doses for longer period than for morphine, for instance?
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, again, most of the time we have no idea what they took, so I think we'd start with a smaller dose, but we would escalate the dose if they're not responding. And we would have done that even 25 years ago, the same thing, because with the synthetic opioids, methadone, for instance, and others, I mean, they may not respond to the low dose of naloxone anyway, so we would escalate the dose. There is no specific protocol for dosing for fentanyl overdose at this point, and so there's still more of this generic approach.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? So let's go to the other topic. Number 8, please. Number 8, yeah. Actually, opioid overdose is not just treating the patients, but also it has some effects on the public health. And nowadays, the statistics shows that the opioid overdose is rising. So, most of the time, those who are to be killed by opioids, most of them are not in the hospital. They are out of the hospital. So it came to the mind of the public health experts that they should do something out of the hospital to prevent death from the opioids. So actually healthcare facilities all together gathered, and they offered by WHO to prevent opioid overdose in the society. They called it SOS initiative. Next slide, please. Yeah. As you can see here, they aim to cover 90% of each level together. It means that they are intended to target the relevant groups that they may face the opioid overdose. They are not just professionals in the healthcare facilities. They might be their peers, they might be their friends, they might be their communities that they are living in them. So actually in this program they are going to educate these people how is the opioid overdose and how they should act against the opioid overdose in order to save more life. And you can see that they are intended to cover 90% of those trained people to have access to a supply of antidotes. We mean naloxone at the top. So if they face opioid overdose, and if they have naloxone supply available, they could be able to save the lives. And finally, they wish that of those who have been given a naloxone supply with a carrying naloxone under them, it should be in their hand. It should be available. So if you see all together, it means that they are going to protect people against opioid overdose by supplying and by helping the other people to get more familiar with opioid overdose, those who are not mostly healthcare professionals, and teach them how to use naloxone for those peoples. And actually nowadays in many countries they are doing like this. I'm not sure, for example, in Iran we haven't such a program. In Turkey, I know you have not such a program, but for example, in France, they have such a program. So I want to ask Bruno, if you have any data regarding a less number of dead people because of opioid overdose, comparing the past when the naloxone was just available for healthcare professionals, and nowadays that it should be available for many people.
As I showed, has been demonstrated that they increase the number of overdoses and may prevent about
coming to hospital.
Yes, about 25,000 opioid overdoses that may have been fatal in patients with this program. In France, it has been implemented 2 years ago, and now we have intranasal naloxone and intramuscular naloxone that are available at home with advantages and disadvantages of each of them. Intranasal naloxone is easier to perform with people who have no medical background. They are not prepared just administer, but the absorption is slower than intramuscular. The concentrations are comparable between those groups, but the peak is later than intramuscular. The second difficulty is intranasal. You have to do it well, because sometimes you see some people that before giving the naloxone program try
to push it. Yeah.
In the air, and then they put in the nose, there's no more naloxone. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
Intramuscular, you have to be not afraid to inject with a serum, but the peak is earlier. So both are available now, but we have known that. But what is important to know, the indication is not to treat an overdose. It's just to delay the time of
respirators.
Severe respiratory depression. That means that to give time to pre-hospital medical services to come at home and to manage the overdose patient. So it's not a question of So if you use this naloxone, you have to call
the ambulance.
Medical services come at home. It's not a trick.
Yeah. So this is a big concern. Actually, in many countries, it depends on the cultural issues. That when they are using naloxone intranasally, it means that probably